You are listening to MyHRBuzz, brought to you by MyHRConcierge. Hosted by Chris Cooley, we'll bring you various topics and guests to shed light on the often confusing world of HR and also employee screening. We'll be putting the human in human resources.
I want to thank you for joining us today on MyHRBuzz, the podcast. I think we've got a great topic. We're talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is something that we get a lot of questions on. And to make it all make sense, we have Emily Frederick, who is with MyHRConcierge. She's a senior HR consultant and also our go-to source in this area. So I appreciate you joining us today, Emily.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm always happy to be here.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Well, ADA, it's something that we get a lot of questions on. There's a lot of nuance and ambiguity to it.
Mhm.
So tell us a little bit about, just from an overview, what is ADA and some of the requirements?
Yeah, so the ADA was signed into law in 1990, and it is meant to ensure that individuals with disabilities have equal rights in a lot of different areas, but especially in employment. So they have equal rights and opportunities just as everyone else does. Employers for employers, what this means is just not only that they need to be avoiding discrimination, but also employers need to be proactive about accommodations and inclusive practices. So there's a lot to it. I guess if we start with the really big basics, it's the Americans with Disabilities Act, of course, and it applies to employers with more than 15 employees. So even most small businesses need to comply with the ADA. And it, again, prohibits discrimination against qualified individuals with disabilities in all aspects of employment. So that's hiring, promotions, job assignments, training, compensation, and termination. And then, so someone has a qualified someone is a qualified individual with a disability. Under the ADA, having a disability means some sort of physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more areas of your life. So it's not exactly the same thing that qualifies as a disability for, say, short-term disability insurance or long-term disability insurance. But to be a qualified individual, that person has to be able to perform the essential functions of the job with or without an accommodation. So it means that employers are not required to lower their performance standards. So the essential functions of the job, the core job duties, still have to be accomplished, but they are required to sort of level the playing field for individuals with disabilities, where it's reasonable.
Okay. So, and when we talk about disability, is that something that they necessarily have to have a doctor's excuse for? Is that something, how does that come across, and how does an employer determine if it's legitimate, not legitimate? How do they go about that?
Yeah, so it sort of depends. So if an individual has an obvious disability, the guidance is that an employer just would completely leave it alone until the employee brings up the fact that they might need an accommodation. Now that's once they're all actually in the position and performing the job. If they're performing the job and they have what appears to be an obvious disability, an employer doesn't need to say or do anything. Now, if they are performing the job not well, if there are some barriers to the job being performed properly, and the employee has an obvious disability, then an employer can ask if they need any accommodations or see how they might better help the employee perform the job. And then in that instance, when an accommodation is requested, there might be some need for a medical documentation, but it isn't always. It's sort of on a case by case basis.
Okay. And I think that's key is when and when not to ask from an employer perspective, because Lord knows we've been doing this for 16 years, and we run across all kinds of things that happen where someone's either going through the hiring process and saying, hey man, you were limping when you walked in. What's the problem? You got a disability? or just multitudes. We see it all the time where people ask things that they shouldn't. And so from an employer perspective, that I think that is so important on when to know when you can and can't, kind of what you can and can't say, and then also how to move forward with that. So if we go through and they do ask for the accommodation, what happens then? What should the employer do?
Yeah, the next step is called the interactive process, and it's where the employer is engaging in a conversation, an ongoing conversation with the employee to see how the job can best be accomplished. So it's a collaborative dialogue, and the employee and the employer together will look at things, look at some things that could help the employee do the job better, and then the employer can decide at that time if they're able to meet that specific accommodation. So there are some really important things about an accommodation request. It doesn't have to be formal. That's really important. So if an employee is having an issue and maybe there's just a conversation around I've been having trouble getting to work lately because, I've got this medical condition, or, I get to work late because of this medical condition, or something like that. If an employee just says something like that, that is essentially stating the need for a medical accommodation for a disability. And the employer then needs to begin engaging in the interactive process, which is just having an ongoing dialogue with the employee. It's really important that the employer responds to that and responds promptly as soon as that they've been made aware that there's something going on. Or, of course, if an employee brings it to the attention of a manager or supervisor that they're having an issue and says, I think this accommodation might help with my issue, then it's important then to start moving along into the interactive process where the employer and the employee are working together to see if that request can be met.
Okay. And I guess from an accommodation perspective, well, one, a couple of things. One, that it not having it, you really on your front lines, if you will, it sounds like you really have to have some supervisors that kind of understand this process. Because it doesn't have to be an overt request. It could just,
Right.
to your point earlier, it could be where they saw something where they haven't been fully doing their duties or having issues with their duties, or it could be just something as simple as saying, "Hey, I've got these medical treatments," and so I guess training is a huge component to this on the front ends, especially for those businesses that are larger that have supervisors and a supervisory level, if you will, where it's not a smaller business where the owner, may converse with everybody on a regular basis.
Yeah, the training is important. It's important that supervisors know what questions they can and cannot ask. Um, there's no, like you mentioned earlier, say, hey, I saw you walking with a limp, so
Yeah.
I'm going to assume you can't do your job very well. Well, that's immediately a discriminatory statement. So it's important that managers know that what they need to focus on is what an employee can do, and then what an employee may need so that they can do their job better. So, if an employee were, again, back to I've been coming to work late because I've
Mm-hmm.
got this medical issue. And we've seen some instances where an employee was missing work altogether because of a medical issue, and the employer felt that the employee had not disclosed that medical issue previously, and all of a sudden they're missing a lot of work, and so the employer just went ahead and terminated. And they actually wound up getting sued by the employee with an EEOC lawsuit because they never engaged in the interactive process to see how they could accommodate the employee's absences due to a medical issue. So accommodations can take lots of different avenues. There are a lot of different things that can be accommodations based on the need to help the employee's disability. A modified work schedule is one, which is really, really common, especially if someone just has recurring doctor's appointments or has times when they need to be away from work. There are others like making a workspace more ergonomic. You can maybe an employee can be assigned to a different position that's already open if they would be able to do that job better. There are a lot of different things that can be accommodations. Even leaves of absence, unpaid leaves of absence can also be an accommodation.
Yeah. And one thing you talked about was the example of the termination with the the person that was missing work.
Mhm.
And that's one reason. I know one thing that we do with our clients is, if you're going to term somebody, call us, because there can be so much nuance to that, because a lot of times we may hear, oh, well, they just never came to work, or they're just not doing their job very well.
Yeah,
Those kind of things. And we really have to go into that second and third level to figure out maybe what's causing that issue.
that's
And then
right.
when you get to that level, it could be, to your point, maybe they have a disability, or even it could be like an FMLA issue where they're having to take care of a spouse, or, I mean, there could be a lot of different things there.
Mhm.
So that's one thing whenever you do terminate, and this is a little bit off topic, but when you do terminate, always kind of have someone review that to make sure that there aren't underlying issues there that could get that company in trouble. Because I know we've cleaned up a lot of those messes where companies have done that, and then they get a claim, they get a whatever that may be. And then, obviously we'll step in and assist with that to get them out of that issue. But I think that's a great point, and something that companies really need to think about whenever they do a termination.
Yeah, yeah. That the interactive process needs to happen so that they're having the conversation with the employee to say, what can we better do to support you? But just as important, if not more important, than is well, just as important is that the interactive process has to be documented, fully
Mhm.
documented. Every from the time the employer was made aware of the disability to what accommodations were requested or were offered, and what was determined to be reasonable or was determined to be unreasonable, and then what the final outcome was. Because in the event that there is some sort of lawsuit or legal case, the employer needs to have documentation of every single step in the process. Um, there were some interesting things that never occurred to me, like if an employee lets you know that they have a disability, but they request an accommodation that the employer just says is entirely unreasonable. They say, um, just for instance, say this is a manufacturing job that requires you to be on your feet 8 hours a day. And the employee says, actually, I would like to work remotely. That's the accommodation I'm requesting for my
Yeah.
manufacturing job. Well, the employer sees that that is a completely unreasonable request, but they cannot just simply deny the request and stop the process. That's not going through the full interactive process. They have to work with the employee to explain why that would be an unreasonable request and see if that there could be other requests, other accommodations that could work for the employee, rather than just throwing your hands in the air and saying, well, this employee is entirely unreasonable and we're not going to work with them at all. They're being ridiculous.
Yeah.
So everything has to be documented, even when it seems unreasonable.
Yeah. And yeah, and to your point with HR, document everything. When in doubt, document.
Yep, absolutely.
But that's a good segue. So we've gone through that process, and they're asking for the accommodation. What do we, what does an employer have to comply with, and what do they not, as it comes to that accommodation? What is an undue hardship on the business, and what is not?
Sure. It really varies it varies case by case. It varies business by business, accommodation by accommodation. Um, what the ADA says is the official definition of an undue hardship is a significant difficulty or expense in relation to the company's size and resources, which of course just leaves it wide open. There are so many things that would and would not fall into that. But to that point, the ADA specifically states that usually something costing the company money does not qualify as an unreasonable accommodation. So just because it's going to cost a little bit, especially when compared to the size of the company, the profitability of the company's resources, usually cost is not an unreasonable request. There are other things. Now, if it is unduly expensive based on the company's resources, or if it's just a hugely substantial or disruptive change that needs to be made and something that would fundamentally alter the way that the company does business, that can usually be considered an unreasonable accommodation.
So I could see where the larger you are, the harder this is. Because if you're a small company and somebody's needing an accommodation that costs 10 grand, it's like, we can't afford that. If you're Home Depot, AT&T, and somebody says, I need an accommodation that's 10 grand, at that point, maybe it is reasonable because they're billion-dollar companies. And so I could see where it really gets nuanced in that process.
I actually have a really great
Uh-huh.
story about something like that. My husband has worked in manufacturing for years, and he had an employee in one of his work sites that this company printed and bound books, and the employees were required to walk from one workstation to the next to get their books put together. And they hired an employee who was otherwise qualified but was blind. And so typically in a manufacturing environment, there are stripes on the floor that show you where you're supposed to walk to your next workstation.
Uh-huh.
To accommodate this blind employee, they actually, on the floor, they put cording and taped down the cording so the employee could use their walking stick to make it to the next spot. And then in the printing and binding equipment, there were certain changes that could be made so the employee could feel using Braille on what buttons were supposed to be pushed, where the books were supposed to be placed, etc. And it's a very large worldwide company that did this, and it wound up being an expense of about $20,000 per workstation that had to be changed. But they wound up doing it for like 5 or 6 different work sites across the country to accommodate blind employees, but they were a massive company. So that was an expense they were able to incur.
Yeah, and that's and I guess for them that was kind of a drop in the bucket.
Right.
So I guess it does, and I guess with that too, it's good because I don't know that you can look at that as I don't know if you can look at that as a one-to-one expense. And what I mean by that is that $20,000 related to that one employee. I guess what it did was now it opens up their workforce to
That's
many.
Exactly right.
Right.
Yeah. So now those spaces are more inclusive, and so they're able to bring in other people with similar disabilities. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No, and I can see that's and I could see where that's a really good thing, and also it is good for the company because it does open up that workforce as far as individuals that they could come in.
Yeah.
Gives them more opportunities to find good employees.
Another instance I can think of, Chris, is I worked for a really large company that we had an employee who needed to be out on a long-term disability. And she wound up needing to be off of work for about 6 months. And because of the size of the company I worked for, we had to accommodate that extended medical leave of absence. Whereas in a really small company, that would be a huge burden. To have an employee just unable to fulfill their job duties for 6 months, and then the company doesn't have someone doing that job, or they'd have to pay extra to have a temp or bring someone in, hire them, and then terminate them later. So that's the difference in where the size of a company matters, and everything is relative based on the situation and the size of the company.
Well, one thing that lends itself to, so we have an employee for a position, and at some point it ends up, maybe there's an individual that's in that position, maybe they have an accident, whatever it may be, and they need an accommodation. And for whatever reason, the business can't make that accommodation, right?
hmm
So maybe that's just not a position, or that's not a position that they can, after that issue or incident, that they can perform any longer. Um, what does an employer have to do in that position? So do they have to try and find another job for this individual if they have it? Maybe one that's less physical, whatever it may be, one that they can perform? Or is that a one-to-one position? So if they can't do the accommodation for that employee for that position, at that point, can they terminate? Or do they need to go and try to find another position within the company?
Again, it's entirely
It's
relative.
nuance.
It's completely nuanced. If there's a vacant position that employee is qualified for, because we discussed before, it has to be a qualified person with a disability in a position. So if that person has the skills, the educational requirements, whatever, for the position that is vacant, then yeah, moving them over into that position is a reasonable accommodation, versus having to terminate employment. If the company can reasonably create a new position for this employee, but again, it has to be reasonable.
Right.
There's nothing saying that the employer needs to create an entirely new job if there isn't a job that can be done by this employee. So at the end of the interactive process, if everything has been documented, the employee and the employer have worked together and found that there is no reasonable accommodation to continue employment in any sort of capacity, then at that point, the employer can reasonably terminate the employment, and just make sure everything is documented really, really well.
Yeah. And I guess, the overarching to this is hopefully a good employee, that employer is going to do everything they can to keep them, right? Because,
Yes.
good employees can be hard to find. And so hopefully, regardless of those circumstances, that employer is going to try to keep them and do whatever they can to do that. So we've kind of walked through this process. We've gone through the interactive process. Um, what happens if we ask the wrong questions, we terminate when we shouldn't, we don't do the accommodation, so now we've kind of gone the wrong path as an employer? What's our liability there from a discrimination perspective?
Um, well, in a lot of cases, the employer could be looking at an EEOC lawsuit. And then when we receive notice from one of our employers that they have gotten notice of an EEO lawsuit claim, of course, our first recommendation is they need to seek legal counsel. And
Right.
that's bottom line. Seek legal counsel, and every situation is different. I think in a lot of instances it goes to some sort of arbitration, in which the employer is essentially urged to negotiate with the employee and settle out. It's very costly, and
Yeah.
I mean, employers can be looking at payment for back wages, future wages, essentially pain and suffering, and
Mhm.
it comes to a huge sum of money when that happens, versus I actually saw a statistic yesterday that, and I can't cite it, I wish I could, but it said that the financial burden for most ADA accommodations is around $300. So
Yeah.
when you're looking at that as a financial burden versus the tens of thousands of possibly hundreds of thousands of dollars that could come with an EEO claim, it's such a huge difference.
Yeah. I mean, for an EEO claim, typically, even if you're not guilty, it's going to cost you 5 or 10 grand to defend yourself, right? So you're automatically going to be out 5 to 10 grand, most likely, if a claim is filed with your legal fees and such. And one thing I did, imagine that, is I did a list of some different things that happened, or some different cases. And now, not all cases go to significant penalties, but it is just case after case, and you can go to your interweb Google net and look up discriminatory cases, EEO discriminatory cases, where employers did run afoul of this, and it is fine after fine, 100 grand, 250 grand. There's one here for 450 grand in back wages and interest, where there's a subsidiary of McKesson Corp had discriminatory hiring practices against individuals with disabilities. You have an individual, a blind individual, that was offered it was a phone interview, and this was another case where a blind individual had a phone interview, and evidently the employer did not realize that that individual had software that would take the voice and transcribe it for them so they could read it. The employee was deaf, and so they had the interview like the person, bringing them in for an in-person interview, and when they did, that person asked for an accommodation to where they would have someone there with sign language. At that point, the employer canceled the interview. And so at that point, obviously, there was issues there from a penalty perspective as well.
Mm-hmm.
Some of this is just it's just being ethical, and some of it in common sense. I don't understand. With some of that, I don't understand employers where you would even think that was okay, but some do. But I say all that, and that's a long way to say this is an area that you really need to be careful with,
Absolutely.
because there are a lot of ways that you can that you're going to pay, whether it's through an EEOC claim that you maybe you win, but you're still going to have 5 or 10 grand,
Mm-hmm.
or if you lose, you could be talking six figures for sure, as far as damages and potential back pay and those kind of things.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so, one thing too, and I was going to bring this up, this came out recently, is you also have to be careful with this on the other side, right? So there was a case, it was Champion Media, and there was a EEOC settled lawsuit. And no, I'm sorry, this was one, this was another one. That's not the one. And what they did was they had an employee that had a lot of blow-ups, is what they called them, with fellow employees. Evidently was kind of irrational, those kind of things. And so they made that employee take a test to determine from a personality trait, effectively, to see if he had any mental disorders.
Wow.
And then and when they did that, and so what happened is, I say that to say he had never claimed as a disability.
Mm-hmm.
They forced him to do that to keep his job. And so what he ended up suing them, because under the ADA, because he's saying, I did not claim a disability. You can't force me to take these tests, which they did. And he ended up winning. And it's still in court, but it's gone. He won the original one. He won the appeal, and now they're looking to see they offered him back pay. He's going to get back pay with interest, and they're trying to calculate that right now. So it's also, you got to be careful on the other side of this, where if they don't ask for an accommodation, if they don't say they have a disability, where an employer tries to get ahead of that and start making them do testing or whatever that may be, because there's a lot of, you could run into some issues there as well.
Sure. So it sounds like that company had the employee go and seek medical evaluation when it wasn't a medical issue at all. It sounds like maybe it was a personality issue, a workplace issue, something that needed to have some counseling with that, with like some employer-employee counseling, some conversations. maybe a verbal warning, a written warning, like it is against our company policies to create a toxic work environment, and these are our company standards that you were violating, rather than saying, we think you might have a mental disorder and we need you to go get tested. No, it sounds like maybe he was just an angry guy.
That's right. Maybe he had a bad day. I don't know,
Yeah.
So,
Oh, that's tough. Because
but
it really sounds like the company was trying to be proactive and make an effort, but they ran afoul of a discriminatory law, or a
yeah,
law that proved that they were actually being discriminatory.
yeah. So it's really tough and it's really nuanced. And I know a lot of our clients have questions around it, and I think it's something that a lot of people struggle with. A lot of employers struggle with is exactly how to handle this, which is why we always ask them to give us a call. And now, one thing, I mean, so what do we do? So we've kind of gone through this process. We've talked about the different steps, what kind of not to do and what to do and not to do. So how do we, just from an everyday perspective, what do we need to do to kind of shore up what a company does internally to make sure that we're not running afoul of ADA?
Yeah. So the first thing I'd recommend is, really every company needs to review their job descriptions first.
Mm-hmm.
So the job description needs to be crafted in such a way that it outlines the essential functions of, so what is required for this job, and that includes any physical or environmental conditions, so that when an employee first sees the job description, maybe in the job posting, they can look at it and decide whether or not they are actually a qualified individual for that position. Then the next thing would be to train the managers to use those job descriptions in the hiring process. So, again, all of the essential duties and core functions are listed in the job description. So that needs to serve as a benchmark to evaluate whether or not the candidate is actually qualified to begin with. And of course, then you don't want to focus on any potential disabilities, which could be discriminatory, but focusing on what the employee can do in the essential functions of the job. So sometimes that is literally handing the job description to the applicant during the interview and saying, can you perform these essential functions? Now, it's important that only actual essential functions are listed as essential functions. If something is maybe an extra, something a little bit extra on the side that the employee may also need to do from time to time, that doesn't mean it's an essential function of the job. So the job description and the clarity in the job description is very, very important. Companies need to make sure that their managers are trained. So from hiring managers, asking the right questions, avoiding the wrong questions, and then your frontline managers. So they need to be trained that there are certain things regarding someone's physical abilities or disabilities that just should not be discussed, or they can be discriminatory. And then confidentiality is really important. So once, say that the employee has gone through the interactive process, and as part of that, a medical documentation has been requested, it's important that whoever handles that from the company's perspective is not sharing protected medical information with managers or supervisors. They don't need to know what the employee's diagnosis is or what the prognosis is. That's not a manager's information to know. They need to know what accommodations are being made, or they need to know how they need to interact with the employee. Now, if you've hired someone who, like in our previous example, was blind, the frontline supervisor might need to be will need to be made aware that this employee is blind, and this is how you will work with them on their accommodation so that they can do the job. But as far as medical information, that's all that managers need to be need to know.
Yeah.
And then the company just needs to be sure that they've got a supportive environment where people with differing abilities do feel comfortable working in those spaces.
Yeah. No, and I think that's a good point. And one thing you talk about job descriptions, which I think are so important, and a lot of times they just get shoved to the side.
Mhm.
Just because I get it, they're everybody's doing their job, and that may just not be a project that they put together.
Yeah.
But having those physical and environmental requirements on there is so big. We see so many job descriptions, which basically will just say the job position and tasks.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so important to have those additional pieces to that to make sure they do know what the physical and environmental, because if they're going to be in a hot warehouse all day, maybe they can't do that. Or if they have to stand all day, those kind of things. The other thing that I was thinking about, and we've seen this, where if you are in that hiring process, be very careful what you put in your notes, because if you're hiring someone and you're putting notes on, maybe you have the resume or whatever that may be, any of that can also be used against you. And so we actually had a client that they had a manager that was going through the hiring process, and what they did, and I don't think they meant anything of it, but they would write what was deemed discriminatory notes on each person's resume. The reason they did it was they were just trying to remember in their head, this was that person, so they could kind of tie it back to the interview.
Yeah.
But in a vacuum, if you're looking at that document, you're going, that's pretty discriminatory.
Yeah, they maybe mentioned race or gender or things like that.
Mm-hmm. And so they actually, this person ended up suing the company for not hiring them because of it, and it was a big deal. So what I say to that is also be very careful with the notes that you take, whether on the resume, if you have a hiring platform, in that hiring platform, just be very cognizant of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Things you don't think about all the time.
I know, really, because you don't. When I was younger, a millennium ago, one thing I was always told is whatever you do, whatever you write, assume it's going to be in a court of law.
Mm-hmm.
And that always stuck with me. So whatever you do, always think about if I was on the stand in a court of law and this was read, would it be something that got me in trouble? And if the answer is yes, don't write it down.
Don't write it down. Yeah. No, that's pretty good solid advice, I think.
Yeah. I think I was on my first job when I got out of college, first engagement, and that's what they told me, and I was like, makes sense.
In my first, and I guess this is another one, but not necessarily disabilities, but in my first HR job, I was an office manager, and I was sitting with the general manager of a company. We were hiring a whole new staff, and the manager was set that he wanted to be the person to interview the employees. And we sat down we had interviewed a bunch of men. We sat down with our first woman candidate, and he immediately, I think he was just trying to be friendly. He didn't know better, but he immediately was like, tell me about yourself. Are you married? Do you have kids? And I just sat there and I was like, no, we don't ask those questions. But he had no idea. He had never been formally trained on an interview process, and people don't think about what kinds of things are discriminatory.
Yeah, and that happens so much because a lot of times people are promoted into those supervisory jobs not because they know HR.
That's right.
Not because they're good at their job. And their job is making that sandwich, making those parts, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And they get in there and they don't know. And to them, they think it's friendly.
Yep. Yep.
And, you just got to be careful. I know back in the olden days, we would cringe every time we hired somebody because we had all these different locations, and everybody there was extremely, I'm not going to say old school, but they'd all been around a while and probably in a different time where some of those things were acceptable, but they weren't anymore. And yeah, we would just cringe and when they would do that. But it's training, and it's just letting them know.
Yep. Yeah. It's evolving training.
It
What
is.
used to be just fine is no longer just fine, and we need to work on all of it.
That's right. You're exactly right. Because I know the often, it's all changed. And to your point, it seems like it's just changing quicker. It's
Yeah.
just changing faster. So, well, good. Well, no, I think that's very interesting. Hopefully that's helpful to everybody. I think,
Yeah.
again, it's such a nuanced thing with ADA, and we get so many questions, and it's a lot of times it's just hard to understand. And, for those employers that are going through these things or have terminations, it's always best to speak to someone, just to make sure you're going down the right road. And I think you gave a lot of great advice, and I appreciate you joining us.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me.
Good deal. Well, I want to thank everybody for listening to the podcast, and please let us know if you have topics that you'd be interested in hearing. And we appreciate you joining us, and we'll talk to you next time. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the MyHRBuzz podcast presented by MyHRConcierge. For more information on this topic and many others, please visit our blog at www.myhrbuzz.com. It's a free resource and has a lot of great information on HR and employee screening related topics. If you like the podcast, please do 3 things for us. 1, leave a review. 2, subscribe to the podcast. And 3, tell a friend. Our podcasts are available on iTunes, Spotify, and many other places where you get your favorite podcasts. If you'd like to provide ideas or feedback on future shows, send us an email at podcast@myhrbuzz.com, or you can reach us at 855-538-6947, extension 108. This is Chris Cooley with MyHRConcierge. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to sharing more topics with you in the future.